everyone. Thank you so much, Alicia, for having me. My name is Antonia Kirkland. I'm the global lead for legal equality and access to justice at Equality Now, which is an international human rights organization. And one of our four main thematic focus areas is ending sexual violence. So very glad to be part of this conversation.
Thank you, Alicia. Humbled actually to be among you all, and even beside Antonia in this very interesting and exciting conversation. I'm Ghida Anani. I'm the founder and director of Ab'ad, which stands for Dimensions in Arabic. It's a resource center for gender equality located in Lebanon and serving the Middle East, North Africa. We are an organization focusing on advancing the gender equality agenda as key condition for sustainable peace and sustainable development, but also focusing a lot on ending gender-based violence and notably sexual gender-based violence as key focus in our advocacy and policy work. Other than working on supporting survivors and advancing the approach of working with men and boys as essential to be restoring the equation of gender equality in the society, especially in countries like Lebanon and the MENA region, where social norms and toxic masculinities and patriarchy is governing all our policies and structures and strategies. So thank you so much for having me as well, and for allowing a voice from the Middle East and allowing the voice of women in Lebanon.
Thank you both so much for being here. I think it would be great to hear more from you, Ghida, on the successful campaign that you ran to end rape marriage. And if you could just start off by telling us what that means. I think it's an unfamiliar term to most people in the Bahamas and in the region. If you could just tell us what that is and what that process looked like of developing this campaign and actually executing it. Oh, you're muted.
Yes, actually, we have this very shameful and article in our legislations in the Middle East, which is allowing the rapist to escape punishment shall he marry the victim, which is called marrying your rapist law. So that is part of the penal code, you know, in a country like Lebanon, which is mostly common in the Middle East. Our legislations are far from being civil, and they are governed by the religious structure and by social norms. And we have something called the personal status code, that are the legislations that govern the relationship under marriage and eventually regulate rights under divorce. And also these are they follow the confession, that is a subcategory under each religion. We had this article in the law, which is more reflective of social norms related to victim blaming, but also related to losing the aspect of virginity as a kind of dishonoring the family. Shall the loss of virginity is happening outside the marriage. And usually, you know, and this is common maybe globally, the victim blaming culture, especially towards survivors of rape, is something quite common, as if you are to be blamed to what happened to you. But also the only solution, remediation, perceived in the society is that, okay, if you raped, you lost your virginity, then you're no longer a candidate for marriage. And the only way, no one's gonna marry you afterward. And the only way to wash the shame and to find a solution is by arranging a kind of marriage for the survivor, not even perceived as a survivor or even like a kind of victim. But this is the only solution. And mostly the negotiation happened toward asking the woman to marry the same person who raped her. And this was very well translated in our legal text, because if the rapist agreed to do so, actually, he will escape totally the punishment. So we started this campaign mainly and inspired actually by the survivors themselves that were running away and coming forward to our emergency safe shelters because of refusing to marry or by seeking a safe and confidential accommodation, because also they are risking to be killed under the name of honor, being no longer virgin and being a survivor of rape. And this company for survivors like really made us consider heavily on empowering a group of survivors to be themselves leading the advocacy campaign, be the actual one going in front of the parliamentarians to say actually a white dress doesn't cover rape, meaning that marriage will not really wash away what happens as a violation of their rights and violation of the integrity of their own body and their choices. So we started the campaign by a protest of survivors in the downtown of Beirut in front of the parliament, where we had them like wearing this white dress. But also we had like a group showing how much this can affect and has a manifestation for a wide range of women, meaning we had women with the special needs, we had a transgender, we had even juvenile, we had those that are also living marital rape on a daily basis, also sometimes as a result of marrying the rapist, but also as a practice, which is also violation of their integrity. We had women from different classes, women with veil, to show that is really what is to be blamed and what is to be attacked and accusated toward, like is actually the rapist and the rape behavior, and not the sort of not the women themselves. And that with the and with this kind of starting with the demonstration, followed by power of data to show how many are affected and how many actually they lack knowledge about the legal structure, followed by also an exhibition in a public space where we hanged white dresses with the stories of multiple women across the country, testimonials, media campaigning. We were able to actually repeal the article during 16 days and push toward studying how much this started to change the mentality toward considering marriage as a solution, and also pushing for reconsidering the redraft of the entire chapter in the law that is talking about sexual violence, inclusively marital rape. So it was the first step. We wanted to reconsider as well, when you have manipulation, you have loss of virginity because of manipulation and promise of marriage. This is something also in our law. Like raping juvenile survivors, because the penalty is not it was like, you know, equal. When you rape someone on the street, you rape a child, you rape a woman, you rape your spouse, which is not even listed, because our law says if you rape any other than your spouse, as if like you're legitimating and you're fine with marrying your wife, raping your wife because she's your property. So today we have a comprehensive draft rewriting the entire chapter, using like even conditions and factors where penalty can be even escalated, inspired by examples from globally. And of course, that was currently this year parked in the parliament, where we don't have any political life because of what's happening, from the demonstrations to COVID to the Beirut, with the recent Beirut Black, where we're trying a little bit to keep the debate open publicly, but at the same time being very realistic about how much we can, any kind of legislative reform per se. So I'm gonna stop here. I know there might be multiple questions to allow space also for some discussion with colleagues attending this webinar.
Thanks so much, Ghida. That's a really great overview of what the situation was and how you're kind of progressing throughout the campaign and the work that's still left to be done. People who are tuned in, let me know if you have any questions. You can type them into the chat. But just from what you were talking about, Ghida, it made me think about some of the roadblocks that we often face in doing this work, where we're trying to make changes to laws to improve the lives of women and to increase protection and expand women's human rights. One of the things that comes up a lot is, why are we looking at the law now? We're not going to be able to change the law until we change people's minds. And it's this idea that we need to do one thing before the other, and people have very strong opinions on what needs to happen first. And then you also brought up the examples from around the world of how other people have tackled this issue and what laws look like elsewhere. So I'm going to bring Antonia in at this point, because Antonia, I know you do a lot of work with people all over the world looking at laws in different regions. Do you have any thoughts on how people are navigating this situation where there's sort of a divide between whether we need to look at the law first or we need to deal with people's hearts and minds, and how one can influence the other?
Well, that's a great question. And I think the work that Abad and other organizations in Lebanon did to change those hearts and minds was so inspiring. I remember seeing the pictures at the time of the wedding dresses hanging, and it was amazing to see that movement. And I know other countries like Iraq are looking at and have been using those sort of advocacy techniques to try and change similar laws, since there are ones that still exist in the region. I think, yeah, the law, of course, is not the end in itself always, and there has to be public awareness raising as well. And it can't be just about the criminal law. There also has to be support for survivors. But it is a really important sort of ground zero step, we believe, to get the law right in the first place. And so we do actually, or we are still working with partners on the ground, such as in Kuwait and other countries, to change similar laws. And one important strategy that we do is to work at the international level and get the UN to pressure governments to make those changes based on international law and the commitments and treaties that they've ratified already. So we can keep that pressure up on governments at the global level when they're coming before those committees, even if things on the ground are not very stable. If they're reporting at the international level, we take advantage of that. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, so there are multiple things going on while advocates and organizations on the ground are doing the work of engaging people in government and also having these very public-facing campaigns for other people to see. Like, I can imagine, this picture of all of these wedding dresses hanging and everything that display means, and kind of forcing people to think about it a little bit more. So that's happening while maybe sometimes the same advocates and organizations, but also international organizations that support the work, are still advocating at the UN level and agitating on a different level and from a different sphere and with a different degree and exercise of power. So the pressure is coming from multiple sides, right?
Yes, exactly.
Ghida, how did you find navigating, I guess, actually getting the attention of people in the country, like the general public as well as the government, while international organizations are also working? Was there any tension around international organizations having a say on what's happening in the country?
Well, actually, also going back to your first commentary, it's very important to share actually some of the learning that we had from that experience. To start with, I would say one of our major learning was having the power of data. In sense, like in any kind of campaigning, if you don't have like a clear picture of and putting numbers, like striking numbers outside on the cost and also on how much this is affecting the people's life. We did this national opinion poll to understand how much women are aware about this article, how much the population is aware about this article, how many are actually using that article. So the power of number was very important. Secondly, from our learning as well, is to ensure to make it people-led, like the right holders themselves, driving the advocacy force in a way which will bring more attention, and it will bring more authenticity, that it's not about the women groups, because it's only about, like, you know, the feminists asking here and there, and you don't you don't get fed up from, like, you know, talking about women rights as if everyone is disconnected from what's happening. But if you bring forward the people concerns, the right holders themselves, asking for something very specific for that is affecting their own lives. And here as well, like, you need to have tangible, clear, like, you know, ask. And from our learning as well, if you do a building blocks of demand and gains, is much more impactful than asking for a generic right. For instance, it was a very specific, we wanted to repeal that specific article, not talking about a dogma of, like, you know, we want to reform the entire sexual violence related legislations. Third, which was very also important, is to neutralize possible opposition before starting the campaign. What we did over like 6 months before going publicly, we did like one-on-one encounters with faith-based groups, and especially the head of various religions and confessions in the country. We know that possible opposition might come from there. And our role was not like to go say, okay, we want to ask for this. No, we went with a spirit of educating, sensitizing, and at least neutralizing the possible opposition. So we said, like, this is how we define rape. This is how we define also marital rape, and how do we define, like, the cost that might be on a woman being asked against her will for a marriage, and do you consider that legitimate or not? So when they said, like, of course, if she's forced into a marriage, meaning the marriage is not even religiously blessed, like, in a way or another, and we said, if we're gonna ask for this, would you be supportive? They said, yeah, we will not be supportive by necessity, but we will not object you. Okay, because we want to keep the choice also for the women under our various confessions. Anyway, so doing that kind of bilateral understanding who might be possibly your quote-unquote enemy in your demand, and try to sensitize, to bring them on a common denominator, was very key before going into the public campaign. Because if you start the campaign and you don't know, and then all this opposition will come, sometimes with the public discourse and the public discussion, you will lose the focus on what you're asking for. And possibly like an entire debate about sexuality, about sexual violence, about women behavior, and all these things about, like, these misconceptions because of what she's wearing, because of I don't know what. And then you will lose in the public advocacy force and debate the focus on the rightful demand that you're asking for the women and girls. When you avoid that kind of distraction, you have more chances in not only attracting the attention, but also you have more chances in avoiding distraction per se. Lastly is ensuring that you are inclusive in your approach. Like, it's not a fight between women who are supporters, good role models, sometimes influencers, is essential. And I saw also one colleague asking, what about male rape? And do they have some? Of course, they have legal frameworks. It's like under the general sexual assault, our legislations are very gender neutral, but at the same time, but they might face a different type of stigma when it comes to disclosure and saying that actually they are survivors of rape. I would say even clinical management of rape services are not gender sensitive. They're not by necessity taking into account considerations where men will feel comfortable to come forward and benefit from PEP services. But at the same time, also we try in our discourse not to make it as if we only talk about female survivors, though we know for fact that they are the most vulnerable and they are the most affected. However, we're not blaming men, we're blaming and we're accusing the violent behavior itself that is happening, and this is what we're condemning. And we're condemning the system that is allowing such kind of patriarchy, and it's allowing putting women in such vulnerabilities with no resort and with no options. So this is like in a very nutshell what we learned from our experience and what we build upon as lessons for the continuation of our advocacy. At the same time, one of our failure, I would say, like something that went not as we wanted, was more of related to the thin line between if we're asking for protection of violation of sexual rights, at the same time not allowing this to affect other rights under sexuality, meaning there were one article per se that got affected by the large advocacy, which was like, talking about the age where you have the right to have sexual interaction, that is 16. And I know for a fact that is globally we're asking for even lower, like, age when it comes to having the voluntarily choice to have sexual interactions. That was like unpredicted, how the discussion in the parliament might happen. And we were not able at that specific moment in time to open also the debate about sexual and bodily rights, and also the question of abortion, because if you are also pregnant because of rape, in Lebanon, abortion is illegal. And this is something very much interlinked to the question of rape altogether, and even under marital rape for forcing pregnancy. It's an entire discussion. We had to refrain from pushing forward altogether because it would have been too much. But my personal recommendation and learning from that was like, whenever we want to advocate for anything related to women, we need to think of the entire dimension of angles that this might intersect with. So we ensure while asking for a right, we're not violating another right. And that was essential in our practice. The do no harm principle, like in general.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Sometimes there are unintended consequences to your work to advance certain rights. And for those in the Bahamas, you would remember the 2016 referendum. The fourth bill was to include sex in the clause, the non-discrimination clause. And when the government decided to define sex, that became an issue for the LGBT community, because it meant that there could be exclusion of trans people, there could be exclusion of intersex people. And there was sort of a divide in people who were advocating for a yes vote on Bill number 4, because yes, we want to advance women's rights, but do we want to set intersex and trans and more vulnerable people back further than they were before, make it more difficult for them to be able to advance their rights later on? So that was a really interesting point that you made, Ghida, and it's something that I think we have to intentionally think about, because if you're not constantly thinking about what could go wrong or who could this harm, you could easily miss it because you're just focused on moving things forward, moving the campaign forward. Antonia, in your work, have you seen any other systems and practices being used, as Ghida was talking about, neutralizing the opposition, how to engage the opposition in an effective and a meaningful way to move things forward and also to avoid these unintentional consequences?
Yeah, I think Gita's completely right that you have to educate people as well, broadly, whether they're the opposition or not. And I think in terms of, yeah, in this sort of ecosystem of laws that surround sexual violence, it's really important to look at. So, yeah, for example, child marriage, even if you believe, as we do, that the minimum age of marriage, at least in a country like the United States, where it's a contract, marriage is a contract, a formal contract. If you believe the minimum age of marriage is 18, it doesn't necessarily mean that children who have sex with each other in a consensual, non-coercive situation should be criminalized. Not at all. And there has to be a recognition of adolescent sexuality. So sometimes those get mixed up. So I completely agree that you have to be very careful in wanting to protect women and girls in one area of the law, that you don't accidentally impinge on their rights in another area.
We have a question for you, Antonia, from the chat. It's a long one, so get ready. So in reference to a question that I asked earlier, would you say that a certain level of acceptance of a particular law or policy is required from the public before it's implemented? And then the comment is, a few years ago, the Prime Minister of Jamaica wanted to implement policies around homosexuality. The person who asked the question, maybe you could specify what you mean. But they mentioned that they couldn't do it unless the people were on board. And then the person's also referencing the 2016 referendum failure and asking, do you think the implementation of a policy that the people are not ready for could have negative implications, and what might those be? So those are like two big questions.
That is a really interesting question. On first reflection, it sounds a bit of an excuse by the government for inaction, to be honest. And I think, especially where a government has committed under international law to equality and non-discrimination on the basis of sex, and sex being inclusive of transgender, intersex, women, men, everybody, then that shouldn't be used as an excuse, this idea that the public's not ready for it, to go ahead and reform those laws, because law really is an expression of a government's commitment, and how, they see their citizens and how citizens should be treated. So hopefully that answers your question. And I think along with legal reforms that do conform to international law, that there should be an awareness raising and sort of public campaign so that people know their rights and can claim those rights.
Yeah, I think a lot comes up for me from these questions, because there's a responsibility on the government to make laws that support, protect, promote, expand people's human rights, and that's a function of democracy. So like you said, it's a cop-out for government officials to say, well, we can't do this because the people aren't ready yet. You can't wait for people to be ready for other people to have access to all of their rights as human beings. And so in some cases, the law is written in a way that forces governments to look for consensus. So in the situation with our unequal citizenship law and the discrimination clause that we were looking to change, they're all embedded in the Constitution. So it requires a referendum. So it needs the vote of the majority. but it goes back to the issue of what democracy really is, and the issue with putting the rights of vulnerable people to the majority vote. There's a serious issue with that, and we have to figure out how we're going to contend with it. But I think one of the simplest and most obvious ways is that the government has to do more around. It's a huge truck passing. The government needs to do more around educating people about rights, what human rights are, and that it doesn't require our agreement, or our acceptance of what we like to call lifestyles, but that all human beings are supposed to have human rights, and that governments have signed on to it, particularly member states of the United Nations that have adopted all of these different conventions and declarations. We need to have more conversations about those pieces and what they mean, and actually localizing them and making them meaningful to people outside of these, foreign forces, which is the way that we often see international mechanisms. So I guess for you, Antonia, as well as Ghida, I'd love to hear about your experiences with bringing national issues of a particular country to the international stage, and how that's received not only by governments but by members of the public. Is it received in a positive way, negative way? Is there a mix? Because we found definitely here in the Bahamas that it's quite a mix, that international mechanisms can be useful when engaging governments, but members of the public generally aren't very comfortable with it because we don't have enough information on what those are and how we came to make these agreements. So I'd really be interested to know what your experiences have been in making use of international mechanisms.
Yeah, definitely. I would say for Lebanon and the MENA, it's always perceived in a very paranoid way because of also our conditions and the general interference in general of our internal issues by foreign countries, especially Lebanon. Everything is decided on our behalf. So anything that is kind of, we lack information and knowledge about, and it's kind of perceived as imported, as if it's an imposed foreign agenda, quote unquote, because of, as you said, because we don't know, and we fear of what we don't know. And I would say the civil society and the international organizations, we're not doing sufficiently on when it comes to education, as Antonia was mentioning, generally speaking. We consider sometimes that people who speak our same language or are aware about the same knowledge of and connection with what's going on out there with the international frameworks. We don't always simplify information. We don't bring it to the grassroots. We don't ensure that the general public is aware of what we're talking about, not because of only having the culture about it, but understanding how much it's useful and can change their lives. So bringing forward the efficiency of these international mechanisms in the sense of how much they can be useful, it's something that I think we can do definitely better. So people are aware that the weight and the importance of these, how they can benefit their own lives. So what we hear also is that, okay, so let's say 1325, the special resolution, or CEDAW or others. Okay, but then as a woman, I'm living in a rural area, how that would be anyway relevant to me, and how this is useful for my daily life. We did not, I would say, even globally, I've never seen materials that bring this forward in a reality connected way to the daily life of the women themselves, other than, okay, it's your right, CEDAW is this, but this is very generic. But as a woman, why would I be even concerned by CEDAW or the international protection mechanisms, or even 1325? Well, this is a special resolution. This is related to the time of war. This is related to countries and negotiations. They wouldn't get like how the lens and the depth of the 1325 resolution, I can also live that and how I can benefit from these. So the perception is, I would say, is quite and again, not only about is the general audience is like, let's say, only resonating or engaging with, but also feeling non-concerned, as simple as that. And this is not helpful for advocacy. Even if you're talking about marital rape, there are multiple. We supported survivors in the court using some of these international mechanisms as arguments in the text, and talking to judges about, like, this is what these frameworks list, and you can base your actual decision on these and build on it, because Lebanon ratified that. Even judges in the legal system, they lack about all these frameworks, and they lack about these treaties and conventions, and how they are above the local legislations, and how they can use them for the sake of women and girls in the country. This is like just an idea about how this is resonating over here.
Yeah, I think that point about judicial education on international and regional law is so important. And in Africa, where we have one of the most progressive human rights treaties, the Maputo Protocol on the Rights of Women of Africa, we're still educating judges on its importance. It has such progressive provisions regarding FGM, child marriage, abortion. Actually, the only international instrument that specifically talks about abortion. So yeah, I completely agree with what Ghida is saying. We have to make those instruments real and continue to highlight where we get those good recommendations from the committees that really are making a difference in some cases. I think, for example, when the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls went to Morocco, when Morocco still had this kind of marry or rapist law provision, and brought it up in their mission or their visit to the country. That's just another point of pressure on the government to change, which it did. And I think probably in the case of Lebanon, it certainly didn't hurt to have the Committee Against Torture really making very strong recommendations to Lebanon. And then after the repeal of 522, the Human Rights Committee was able to pick up on that and then put further pressure on other provisions that are still problematic in the Lebanese penal code with regard to sexual violence. So just to say, we can build on that, I think, that work at the international level.
Yeah. There's a comment here I'll read from Jeannie. Excellent point raised by the panel on how there can be a different approach to age of consent to sex than age of consent to marriage, to avoid overcriminalization of consensual relations between age pair youth. And by the way, also to ensure they're not deterred from accessing help for contraceptive counseling, for example. And she has linked in the chat for anyone who wants to see an article by Suzanne Petroni that looks to be about the Lancet age of marriage versus age of sexual consent. And it's a PDF, so you can download it really easily. I just want to shift the conversation a little bit now to focus more specifically on the issue of marital rape. And this is something that we need to address here in the Bahamas. It came up in the early 2000s and was quickly dismissed. A bill was brought to criminalize marital rape and quickly went away, and there was no talk of it for a really long time. And it's just recently come up again, and the Attorney General has worked on a bill, and the draft was just unacceptable to both sides. And it's essentially women's rights advocates and organizations on one side, and then the other side is like representatives of churches, Christian churches, that generally they probably would prefer that we didn't criminalize marital rape, but they definitely want the law on it to be softer. And the women's rights organizations and advocates are saying, no, this isn't good enough, because the current bill is refusing to acknowledge that marital rape is rape. It's creating this new category of crime that is called something like aggravated spousal sexual assault. So we know that sexual violence, there's a spectrum of sexual violence, and you have like harassment is at one end and you have rape on the other end, and somehow they're saying that marital rape is somewhere in the middle. It's not rape, right? There are all these strange definitions that people come up with. And this whole process, this whole thing of drafting this bill and creating this new law is actually quite unnecessary, because we literally just need to change the definition of rape in the Sexual Offenses Act. And the issue, it sounds like it's similar to what Ghida was talking about, is just at the end of the definition, it says who is not his spouse. So it's rape is when this happens like this, except if it's somebody who's doing it to his spouse. And we just need to take out those 5 words. That's why our campaign to criminalize marital rape is called Strike 5, because we literally just need to strike out those last 5 words. So I want to talk about this a little bit more, and what I think the advocacy on this is looking like right now. One of the things is that what Ghida mentioned as well earlier is data. We don't have data on this. And this is the issue: when something isn't criminalized, it doesn't get reported. And if it doesn't get reported, it doesn't get recorded. And if it's not recorded, then we don't have the data. So every time you bring this issue, you'll have people, if it's a talk show, people are calling in and saying, well, how many people are having this problem? This isn't happening. Where's your data? You can't have data on an issue like this. So that's a definite issue that we're facing. On top of that, there is the sort of distraction that takes place when you haven't neutralized your opposition, like Ghida was talking about. So you'll have people who come up and say, why this issue? Why now? We need to look at this other issue. And then you'll have people who will sort of appeal to various beliefs and belief systems that people have. And we end up going back to this idea of a woman as property. Once a woman gets married, she gives up these rights and she gives unending consent to her husband. So it's very difficult to have a discussion about something when people at their core believe one thing more than they believe anything else. And people believe their faith, right? Like they're very into their faith, their religion, and what their religious leader says. How do we have conversations that allow people to have their faith and practice their faith with dignity without making people's human rights subject to those particular beliefs and doctrines? Any thoughts on that?
I would say, as my original academic background is I'm a medical social worker and a clinical counselor. Topics that is always like director, like really listening to survivors and working with survivors.
I think we missed a lot of what you said. Your sound.
I did that for, more than 10 years. More than 10 years. Yeah, so is it cutting? Sorry, the internet connectivity in the country. As a practitioner, myself being a medical social worker and clinical counselor, I worked for more than 10 years with listening and counseling and doing case management for survivors of gender-based violence, spousal violence mainly, where there were like majority, I would say, are living also conditions of marital rape and marital sexual violence. And this is like mainly was always the consideration of how we really can make these women speak up, but also first and utmost, if I can say, is also to first make them realize anyway that is not okay, because that go back to the entire understanding of the concept of marriage, which is very much associated with as if you become the other's property. And this is very deeply rooted in our social norms, especially stemmed from religion and religious culture, that under marriage, basically, as if you gave away your right to the control over your own life choices, body, rights in general, and as if you should become one, or at least you should acknowledge that the other has the right to do whatever because you become his property. And that is something that is, even if we very strongly refuse, but also this is how women usually think, and this is how they are prepared to become the wife, the obeying wife. And also this is how we have been raised in understanding the concept of marriage. So the very first step, I would say, we're not going to witness the drastic, tangible change in the arena of reforming marital rape related laws and even countering marital rape as a practice, as a violation in general, if we don't start by integrating in the sexual education early in schools, and also everything related to education around marriage, choosing your partner, the marital life in general, as part of the socialization process, but also as part of the religious instructions. We're not gonna see major change because this is deeply rooted in the mentality of women, generally speaking. Secondly, also, they don't realize that is not okay until other manifestation of the spousal violence happen. Meaning, whenever I was asking these women, like, okay, so they come forward to counseling centers just whenever the physical violence start, or like a very severe psychological violence is happening, or some kind of economic violation when they are also deprived from alimony or their daily needs, or also taking away their salaries if they're working, and so on and so forth. And whenever you ask, okay, so what about your intimate? Like, how does it look like? And then they would say, okay, this is always by force. This is always, I don't know what. So as if this is something that is a subordinate in the living that they have. They wouldn't come to counseling units only to talk about, like, he's forcing me into sex, or like this is happening in my marital life. They don't consider that this is a form of GBV that is worth even disclosing. This will come as if because he's violent, generally speaking, yeah, this is also happening in our intimate life. While we know as clinical practitioners that this is actually the signs of gender-based violence, sometimes they started over there because this is where there's an abuse of power and abuse of power relationship. This is where the manifestation of the lack of communication starts. And this is where, anyway, the practice of imposing your opinion or imposing your choices starts as well. But this is where he feels the man, basically. And then this can also have manifestations on other aspects of your spousal and marital life in general. Then, lastly, like, there's a point that also was a kind of learning as well for us, which was understanding, having common denominator on definitions. When we were talking to religious leaders about rape, and of course mentioning marital rape. So they were saying, no, 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 we can't talk about like, you know, rape under marriage because, you know, in our religion, and this is where actually you talk about taking something that is not your right. As we say, raping a land, raping a right, raping something, like, you know, you're taking something that is you're not rightful of. And under marriage, this is not the situation. Okay, but then we said, okay, but if you're actually taking something against the will of someone and this is causing harm, would you be blessing such a thing? They said, of course not. And we said, if this is happening under marriage, they said, of course not. So if you're forcing your spouse to do something against her will, and this is resulting in a harm, this is not something definitely against religion. And we said, but this is what is definition of rape. It's actually asking her to do her whatever spousal obligations, but asking for that against her will. And this is resulting in physical, psychological, and medical harm. So this is the definition of violence by the end of the day. So if you're not using the term sexual violence or rape, it's okay. This is what they are immediately resisting against. But if you say the content, the element of that definition, this is where they found, yeah, we might be speaking the same, talking about the same concept, and we found a common denominator. So we said, so then if in the law we don't use the term marital rape, what we say, sexual intercourse within the frame of marriage against the will of one partner, and it's resulting in a harm, this should be criminalized by the law. They said, of course, we can definitely do that. So we need to understand as activists that it's not the same discourse, it's not the same terms, the conceptual understanding of many of the terms that we use, it's not common with those that are actually responsible of influencing any change in legislations, because it's not us sitting on that table. They are male figures, parliamentarians representing different political parties or religious groups, or I don't know what, depend on the country, but they don't speak the same language, or they don't have the same terminology and conceptual frameworks about different things. As also as activists in that field, we lack understanding, I don't know, the terms related to environment or something else. So we need to find common denominator on conceptual level and do these kind of dialogue on content of the term, rather than saying, oh yeah, then you're in favor of rape. And then we go and do the scandalous, like, you know, anti-campaign, while by the end of the day, he's not even understanding what rape is anyway. Okay, so before we do that and we do the advocacy force, as Antonia also was mentioning, with judges, with parliamentarians, with policymakers, we need to ensure that at least we are defining concepts in the content in the same way, even if we use different terms. Not different terms in meaning like that, not totally different, but at least we can. I would as an activist for women in the Middle East and in a country as confessional as Lebanon, I would compromise not using the term rape in the text while I put its full definition. It's fine. I don't want to say the word, but at least I would say what is causing to women, and it's criminalized. I can live with that, rather than just like, you know, pushing for you need to use it. No, that's not. We shouldn't compromise any gain for women just for the sake of you need to say the same thing that I'm saying. That is a shortfall, that's for sure.
Antonia, do you have any thoughts on that?
I completely agree that, you know, I think if you can educate people about the actual harms of the behavior, that's the most important thing, and get them to want it to end. And one of our strategies is through the law and implementation of the law. Then I think, yeah, that's better for all women and girls. I think in terms of the law itself, when, you know, speaking to governments, I do think that marital rape is something that actually probably should still be expressly criminalized, rather than the law actually being silent, just because there are those patriarchal police officers, judicial officers who are not going to implement a provision that doesn't expressly say marital rape is criminalized. So that's another way to educate those folks to, you know, do the right thing and protect women and girls in those situations, and provide justice for those whose rights have been violated in the family, in the marriage, or in the, you know, intimate partner relationship. Um, yeah, so I think naming it still at this stage, there's, according to UN Women, only 77 countries that expressly criminalize marital rape. So we still have a ways to go around the world. And I think, you know, when the law actually encourages marital rape, that's very problematic. So, for example, in the US, there's a federal provision to statutory rape, which is rape of minors, where if the parties are already married, it doesn't count as statutory rape. And actually, Jeannie from Tahiri Justice Center, I believe, and they did a fabulous policy brief of all the state level provisions, because here in the US it's a federal system. So really it's the state, the 50 states that have their own penal codes, and a majority of them have a similar provision. So if a girl is a minor and she's already married, it doesn't count as rape, or it's a potential defense. But Jeannie can correct me if necessary. Yeah.
Yeah, Jeannie's in the comments. She says,
so we have a lot of work to do here.
yeah, Jeannie says, as you noted, Antonia, in the US, while many states have recognized marital rape as a crime, the majority of states still make marriage a defense or exception to statutory rape. So sex with a person younger than the legal age of consent to sex.
So basically, it's allowing child marriage, it's allowing marital rape, and continuing sexual violence. So it's completely contradictory and against all norms of equality and non-discrimination. Yeah, perpetuating violence at that level.
Yeah, I think there's so much more that we could dive into, and I wish we had more time to really dig into this idea about definitions and concepts, because I do think that it's important to find the common denominator and figure out where we are saying the same thing, but also to avoid compromise that, you know, refuses to acknowledge that rape is rape, and that allows the state to be able to legislate and to criminalize something, but in a different way from other circumstances. So, you know, regular rape having a sentence of up to 10 years, and then this, whatever they call marital rape, being a year. You know what I mean? That it allows for a lot of discrepancies when we start renaming things. But I think it's worth talking about sorry, the compromises that advocates and organizations and governments and religious leaders and leaders in other sectors are making, and how those compromises are contributing to or taking away from progress, and how much unintentional harm is done there. I mean, there's just so much to dig into there, but I want to make sure that we have some time for others to chime in if anyone has questions, comments, or challenges related to anything that we talked about, or anything that you hoped that we would talk about that we didn't get to yet. If you type them in the chat or use the raise your hand function so that I can come to you and you can unmute yourself to ask your question. Give you a couple of seconds to warm up and think really hard about if you want to ask. All right, if we don't have any questions, it is midnight where Ghida is. So I think that we should do the gracious thing here. I'm going to thank Antonia and Ghida, both of you, for coming and having this discussion. I think that you've raised so many great issues and shared so much learning from your own experience in campaigning in Beirut, Lebanon, and all over the world. Antonia, the work that Equality Now is doing is amazing. Our series is continuing beyond today. On Saturday, we have a session that's just for youth. So we were talking about, I think Ghida mentioned, the importance of talking to young people and making sure that they understand relationships and what they look like. So that's what Saturday is all about, Saturday at noon. To sign up for that, you can register at tiny.cc/healthyonline. We'll be hearing from Taitu Heron, who is the head of the Women in Development Unit at the University of the West Indies Open Campus in Barbados. So she'll be doing a session for young people about consent and healthy relationships. And then she will be followed by Alicia Roll, who will be talking about being safe online, having device detoxes, and how to use social media in a safe way. On Monday, we have a discussion between Aaron Green and Emilcar Sanatan from Trinidad. They'll be talking about men, masculinity, and the LGBT community and connecting that to gender-based violence. That is at 6 p.m. on Monday. And on Tuesday, our final event is focused on women in the workplace, where we have a number of guests who will be bringing human resource expertise, their activism expertise. We have Ardra Manassi, who is the campaign coordinator at the Center for Women in Global Leadership, that's spearheading the whole 16 days global campaign. And we'll be talking about the International Labor Organization's Convention 190 for the elimination of violence and harassment in the world of work. And that's a really, really interesting piece. I really can't wait to get into more of that. For registration links to remaining events, tiny.cc/16 days registration. And I am losing my voice just in time to say thanks again, and hope to see you at one of the upcoming events. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. That was refreshing, even from my side. Thank you. Bye-bye.